Hey everyone. So we're fixing to do Unit 2, Lecture number 3 for Dual Credit Biology 1. There's a couple things that you're going to need in order to be successful during this lecture. One, you need to pull up the PowerPoint, which is found in the Google Classroom under the Unit 2 and 3 material. You can pull that up, or Unit 2 material. And then you're also going to want a few index cards. They can be blank on each side, doesn't really matter, but some index cards because we're going to be making some functional group index cards, and that'll save us a little time if you'll go ahead and grab that. And then, of course, you're going to need something to write with, and you may want to grab your textbook just so you can kind of look through and see where we're going to be. So I'm going to let you pause, go find all of your stuff, get it all ready, and then you can start on the lecture. Okay, so we are starting organic chemistry today, and I'm going to tell you right now, organic chemistry is tough. It's probably one of the toughest things that you learn, in my opinion, whenever you are majoring in biology or chemistry, because organic chemistry works with really big molecules that are shaped really funny, and they are very, very sensitive. They do some weird things, but they're also extremely important. All of the organic molecules that we depend on and our major macromolecules are based off of organic chemistry. So we're going to spend some time today looking at some of the basics of organic chemistry. We're going to talk a little bit about hydrocarbons and how they're used as our skeleton. Then we're going to get into how sometimes they are rearranged, which is known as an isomer. And then we're going to end up talking about functional groups, and that's where we're going to make our flashcards. If at any time during the lecture, because this one's going to be a little lengthy, you need to just take a break, pause it, take a break or stop and come back a little bit later. I totally understand. If we were doing this in class, I would have this divided up into a little bit smaller sections, but I'm trying to do this in as few lectures as I possibly can. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and we're going to go to the PowerPoint so that you can see some of the pictures of this. Then we'll go back to a few things and let you look at some stuff that I'm going to build for you. So first thing you need to know is that carbon is the basic element of life. It's extremely important. And so everything that we talk about today is going to be built off of carbon. And I'm going to tell you why carbon is so important in just a second. But when we talk about us and we talk about the chemical level, when we get to those molecular levels, almost every molecule is going to have a carbon base. So let's look a little bit at carbon. So when we talk about organic chemistry is the study of carbon compounds. I took organic chemistry when I was in college. If you're majoring in biology, majoring in medicine, majoring in chemistry, physical therapy, any of those areas that you may look at a degree, you're going to have to take organic 1 and organic 2 and the labs. And I will tell you that while it was difficult, it was extremely rewarding. And labs were some of my favorite labs that I've ever done in college. So it is fun, but it is pretty difficult. So the reason why everything builds off of carbon is because carbon is extremely versatile. When you draw the Bohr model of carbon, you find that in the first shell there are 2 electrons, but in that outer shell there are 4 electrons, and those 4 electrons make it halfway full. And so because of that, it will easily bond to other elements, other atoms, in order to be more stable and to complete its outer shell. So I have this molecule kit, and if we were at school, you would build with these, but we have this molecule kit, and this little black ball here, this is a carbon atom, is what this is supposed to symbolize. So I have these little sticks, and the sticks are bonds. So I'm going to put 4 sticks into this carbon atom. So now you can see that with those 4 places, that means things can bond all around it. And one of the elements or atoms that tend to bond pretty readily besides itself, it will also bond to hydrogen, and hydrogen's yellow. So you'll see right here if I go around, and hydrogen only has one hole because it only has one spot, because it has one electron and there's one spot for one more electron. So if I put all the hydrogens on there, I end up creating this tetrahedral shape, and it's carbon and 4 hydrogens. Okay, so that's why carbon is so versatile. It will also, like I said, bond to itself pretty readily. So you end up with something like this, and then all around that carbon, it will also bond to other elements. And so I can put these hydrogens on there. So in this case, I end up with the molecule C2H6, 2 carbons and 6 hydrogens. Okay, so that's why carbon is so versatile, and we use it, quite a lot. All right, so when we talk about organic molecules, we have some molecules or atoms that we tend to find pretty often. Obviously carbon, the black ones, hydrogen are the yellow ones. We also bond with oxygen a lot, and nitrogen. And basically the whole rule is that they're trying to fill up that outer shell. However many electrons are needed to fill up the outer shell means that's how many holes you would find on the ball. So in this case, it has a place for 2, so therefore it only needs 2 electrons, so this would be an oxygen. Okay, so that kind of gives us an idea. So the whole thing is about making it balanced. So anytime we have a molecule that is completely carbon and completely hydrogen, it is given the name hydrocarbon, and which is pretty standard. So we automatically assume, unless it's told differently when we see a drawing, that we're dealing with a carbon and a hydrogen. And so that just kind of gives you, an idea that that's how commonplace those 2 atoms would be. So here's some examples of some hydrocarbons. So we've already done methane, which was the CH4. This would be ethane. And then you can also, something cool about carbon likes to bond to itself sometimes. So we use these little springs or double bonds. This one off. Now we can go there. It's not going to cooperate. We were in class, this is where springs would be going all over the place. So there we go. Now I've created ethene. And notice that the only difference between ethane and ethene is the ending. Ene means double bond. And so it can do double. We can also have triple bonds, and then it becomes an ine, alkyne. So you would have like ethyne instead, or something like that. So, but anyway, so that's a hydrocarbon, and that spring indicates it's a double bond that runs through there. So when we talk about organic molecules, a very important concept that we need to discuss is something called an isomer. Usually, my example of an isomer is I use Legos. If I were to walk into class and give everyone a Ziploc bag with the same Legos in it, and I tell you, okay, you've got 10 minutes, build me something. Everybody has the same number and the same type of Lego. So you've got, 10 of the little blue squares. You've got 8 of the rectangles that are yellow. You've got 4 flat green pieces. And so I hand you your bag and I say, okay, 10 minutes, use every Lego, build me something. Well, when we get finished, everyone will have something different built, unless they cheated and looked off of a neighbor and tried to copy them, because they get put together differently. But if we were to look at every structure's components, we would find that they're made of the same things. It would be, 8 of this kind of block and 6 of this kind of block and 4 of this kind of block, but they're put together differently. That is what an isomer is. An isomer would be if I handed you so many of the black balls, so many of the yellow balls, so many sticks, and I said, okay, put me together a molecule. Well, what would happen is in the class, half of you would build it one way and half of you would build it another way. But when we looked at the formula, it would be the same, but the structure would be completely different. Different structures cause different properties to be seen, different characteristics of that molecule. And I'll show you some examples of those right now. So, but let's look and see if we can figure out if these are isomers or not. So on A right here, we have ethane and propane. So the first thing you do is you look at what it's made of. So ethane is C2H6, propane is C3, and that's H678. H8. So they have a different formula. So they would not be an isomer, okay? Take a second and look at butane and isobutane. Is it an isomer? Does it have the same formula, just built differently? Yes, it does. Same number of carbons, same number of hydrogens, it's just put together differently. Take a second and look at 1-butene and 2-butene. Are they the same as far as their compound and they're just built differently? Yes, that is an isomer. And then we can even have them bent into rings. This is cyclohexane and benzene. Take a second look at those. Are those the same formulas? No, they're not. Because those double bonds, it changes how many hydrogens, so that would not be an isomer. And we have three types of isomers. We have structural isomers, geometric, and then we have one called an enantiomer. So a structural isomer tells us that they're just arranged differently, like butane and isobutane. In this case, they have the 4 carbons going across, surrounded by hydrogens. In this one, they stuck a carbon coming off of that middle carbon, and they added the hydrogens all around. Same formula, different structure, so it's a structural isomer. Geometric isomers are a little different. They're built a little differently because of double bonds. That butene that I showed you a couple slides back, that because of that double bond, it causes it to bend a little differently, and that bending keeps it from being the same as maybe the original molecule would be. So double bonds or triple bonds, they can cause a change in the spatial arrangement, the three-dimensional arrangement of that molecule. So that makes it a geometric isomer because it's geometry. The last one is, to me, one of the most interesting. It's called an enantiomer. I tell people it's like the evil twin. An enantiomer has the exact same chemical formula because it's an isomer, but what happens is somehow it was put together with an asymmetric carbon. So you end up with mirror images. I tell people, think about gloves. Now, here in South Mississippi, it gets cold. Most of y'all wear those mittens or those little knit gloves that you get that doesn't matter if they're right or left. But if you live somewhere where it got cold a lot, or if you bought a pair of really nice gloves, you would find that there's a left glove and a right glove, okay? You can't flip-flop gloves because one of them is shaped like this, the other one is shaped like this. Now, even though they're made of the same thing, they're put together differently. They're mirror images, and so they behave differently. Something kind of interesting about these different isomers, organisms are extremely sensitive to the change in the way that a molecule is built, their architecture. They may not do the same thing that they were supposed to. Probably one of the most well-known isometric variations was back during World War II. Those of you who've taken U.S. history, you've probably heard the song "We Didn't Start the Fire" by Billy Joel. Well, they talk about this thing called children of thalidomide. Thalidomide was a medicine that was given to soldiers to quell motion sickness. If they had to ride on a boat, if they had to fly in the air, this was not easygoing flying, easygoing sailing, so they would get seasick. And if they got seasick, then, they couldn't fight. So they would give them these tablets of thalidomide, and it worked really, really well. So well that, back home, women who were suffering from morning sickness due to pregnancy, they thought, well, why not give them thalidomide? It helps with queasiness. So they started giving it to women who had really bad morning sickness. Well, the problem is that Some of the thalidomide was perfectly fine, but some of the thalidomide, when it was put together, it was put together as an enantiomer. And the enantiomer, the mirror image, caused fetal development problems. So what happened was you got an effective drug with the original thalidomide, but its evil twin, even though it had the same chemistry, its architecture was different, it caused birth defects. And a lot of children born as a result of the enantiomer of thalidomide were born missing bones in their appendages. And this is a picture of a child who suffers from thalidomide exposure. So I thought that was pretty interesting. There was also an asthma inhaler years ago, several decades ago, that had an enantiomer. One asthma inhaler, you took a puff, it quelled you of your asthma attack. The other caused death. And so when you ran it through chemical analysis, the chemistry was the same. It wasn't until later when we began to look at structures of molecules that we realized that it was the structure, the architecture of that molecule that led to the problem. So those are your isomers. Now I want to take a few minutes and I want to talk about something called functional groups. A functional group is basically atoms that are put together in combination that are then attached to a carbon skeleton, and it causes that hydrocarbon to behave differently. There are a few functional groups that we're going to learn, and we're going to talk about what they do to the molecule. And then while we're doing that, we're going to talk about how to make these into flashcards. You are going to have a quiz on functional groups, not only identifying what they're made of as far as their atoms or their elements, but also what properties they give to the hydrocarbon. So we're going to be looking at that as well. So if you've got your flashcards handy, go ahead and grab those and something that you can write on them with, and we'll start talking a little bit about them and what makes them so special. So functional groups are so important that they can change an organism almost in its entirety. This is a good example. The presence of this OH here and this CH here, these changes right there in those two molecules cause the difference in the sex or gender sex of those lions. This leads to a female lion. This leads to a male lion, which, other than the obvious, there's also some subtle differences, like, coats and manes and things like that. And it's all because of just a change in a couple of atoms. So I always tell people, it's pretty amazing that you are the way that you are, because one subtle change and you could be something completely different. So that's how important functional groups are. So these are all the different functional groups that we see, and they get attached to hydrocarbons. And when they get attached to the hydrocarbon then changes to a specific type of molecule. It behaves a little bit differently. So let's run through the functional groups, and then as we go through the different macromolecules, we'll talk about them a little bit more in depth. So the first one that I want to talk about is hydroxyls. What you're going to do on a flashcard, on one side you need to write hydroxyl group, and then on the other side you're going to draw what it looks like, and then we're going to just put a couple of notes. And the notes, of course, will come from this PowerPoint. So if you miss something, you can always go back and access the PowerPoint or rewatch the video. So a hydroxyl group is an OH. So I would definitely put that on there. It's just oxygen and hydrogen. This little dash here means that's where it connects to the carbon. So it would just attach to a carbon there. Hydroxyl groups cause the molecule to change and become very polar, which means that it's hydrophilic. And we know that hydrophilic means it loves some water. When you add an OH to a hydrocarbon, you form an alcohol. Things like ethanol, propanol, isopropanol. These are alcohols, and what makes them different is the number of carbons and then where their OH would be located. The next functional group that I want you to know is the carbonyl group. So you would write carbonyl group, Then on the other side, its structure is a C double bond O. And of course, this little dash means that's where it would attach to the carbon molecule. So it's a C and a double bond O. Carbonyl groups are divided into two types. We have one that's called an aldehyde, one that's called a ketone. And I want to show you what makes those different. So on my carbonyl group, I might would write carbonyl, C double bond O, and then I might would put two types, aldehyde and ketone. And then I would make a special card for aldehyde. So I would write aldehyde. And on this side, it's a C double bond O and an H. And that's because this carbonyl group attaches to the end of a carbon skeleton. Sometimes it's written as CHO, C-H-O. So if you see that in a textbook or on a worksheet, you know that that's an aldehyde. It's a carbonyl group, but because it's at the end of the skeleton, it creates what's known as an aldehyde. And we will see this later on when we get into cellular respiration. A ketone, these are really cool chemicals because ketones have smells. When you buy things like lotions that have scents to them, those lotions are formed, that smell is formed by a ketone. I remember in my organic chemistry lab, we made all the scents that we found for like Victoria's Secret's lotions, like the apple and pear and stuff like that. This was back in the day. And it was kind of neat because what we were doing is we were forming ketones. And a ketone is a carbonyl group, that's C double bond O, but in this case, instead of being on the end, it's right here in the middle. So I would write ketone, and then on the other side, I would draw that CCC and put the double bond O, and then I might note double bond O is in the middle. Okay, so our next one is a carboxyl group. So a carboxyl group takes a carbonyl group, a hydroxyl group, smashes it together. So what happens is you get a C double bond O and an OH, and it's bonded to a carbon on a carbon chain. Sometimes it's written as COOH, and these are known as carboxylic acids, which are pretty weak acids. So I would write carboxyl group, and then I would draw it. I might would put the COOH because you never know when you'll see it, and then I would put that these form are known as carboxylic acids. The next one, one other thing is carboxylic acids, like I said, they're really weak organic acids. And we know it's an acid because it donates its hydrogen when it's put in water. All right, so amino groups. Now you've heard of amino groups because you've heard of amino acids. Amino acids have an amino group attached to them. So it's a carbon chain with an amino group on there. Later on, we'll talk about what makes an amino acid so special. But amino acid won't be an amino acid unless it has this bonded somewhere onto the carbon. So an amino group is an N with two H's. A hydrogen and a hydrogen, and they form these compounds that are known as amines, and they act as a base, believe it or not, but when you put them with the other components for an amino acid, it becomes an amino acid. But we will look at these a little bit more closely in a couple of lectures, but that's what makes an amino group an amino group, is it has this NH and a H. Sulfhydryl, this is a sulfur and a hydrogen bonded together, and so they'll be bonded to a carbon somewhere on a carbon chain. They form compounds that are known as thiols. Thiols usually have a smell to them too. Some of you have probably taken sulfur-based drugs, and they'll have kind of a weird smell to them because sulfur just has a weird smell. We see sulfhydryls with protein structure. They, when we get to the protein lecture, you'll see that proteins are very complex molecules, and sulfhydryls hold those molecules into that complex structure so that they can behave the way that they need to, because proteins are very, very, very dependent on their structure. And then we have the phosphate group, and a phosphate group, and this should be a difference, it's a phosphorus with 4 oxygens, a PO4. I know this is a little bit different than maybe something you've learned about in Biology 1, but this is the way that we're going to be doing it. It's sometimes known as pi, does have a charge to it. Phosphate groups, you've learned them when you learned ATP in Biology 1. The 3 phosphate groups, one would break off and you would have an energy transfer, and that of course is the basis of metabolism or cellular respiration. So on one side of your card, put phosphate group, on the other side I would put PO4, and then I would make sure that I put in there somewhere about the energy transfer. And then we have a methyl group. Methyl groups are kind of hard to distinguish because it's a carbon with 3 hydrogens and it's stuck at the end of a hydrocarbon. And so it sometimes kind of gets lost and you may not find it, but they cause the molecule to become nonpolar. And a nonpolar molecule is very hydrophobic, which means it doesn't mix well with water. And later on, we'll be doing some labs where the methyl group will play a large role in how the molecule or how that chemical will behave. Okay, so that's our last functional group. Next lecture, we'll be talking about how we use these for macromolecules. So what I would do is I would create my flashcards and I would begin to study those. You need to memorize their names, their structures, and what they do, their characteristics. I do have a practice PowerPoint on the Google Classroom that kind of give you an idea of what it would look like on the quiz, and then we will take a quiz on functional groups. I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. I hope you have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.